All right, in chapter 8, we get a chance to start talking about metabolism. We're going to build a lot of the knowledge that we need then as we move forward to talk about really complex metabolic reactions like cellular respiration in chapter 9 and photosynthesis in chapter 10. So this will be a lot of sort of generic information regarding chemical reactions and chemical pathways that take place in organisms. So as we think about living organisms, like an individual cell, it's almost like the cell is a miniature chemical factory. There are thousands of chemical reactions happening every minute, and they don't stop, right? Your cells, unlike you, they don't sleep. If they were to sleep or take a break, they would die and you would die. So they're just constantly going through a multitude of different chemical reactions to keep the cell alive and to keep you alive as a multicellular organism. One of the probably most important chemical pathways that take place within a cell is the extraction of energy from sugar molecules, and the cells have the ability then to go through this series of chemical reactions, extract the energy from the sugar or other fuels that they might take in, and then apply that energy to actually do cellular work, to transport stuff, to drive other chemical reactions, or if the cell is part of a multicellular organism, that cell needs to do its job as a skin cell or a muscle cell or a nerve cell, for example. Now, some organisms are so cool in that they have the ability not just to extract energy and use it to drive cellular work, but they can actually extract energy from certain molecules and convert that energy to a different kind of energy, light. And they have the ability, therefore, to bioluminesce. So in this particular slide, you can see that there are glowing mushrooms, right? These are mushrooms that can take energy out of molecules and turn it into light energy, allowing them to glow, which is definitely very cool. Now, this chapter is titled Introduction to Metabolism. Probably we've all heard the term metabolism before, but when you think of metabolism, you're thinking of nutrition, right? What you eat and how your body processes the nutrients that you consume, right? You might think, oh, I've got a great metabolism. I can eat whatever I want and I never gain a pound. Or other of us will give you the stink eye and we'll say, well, I just look at a donut and I gain 10 pounds, right? When you think about metabolism that way, you're not wrong. In fact, you're right along the right lines there. Metabolism in scientific terms is defined as the totality of an organism's or a cell's chemical reactions. And so this encompasses, yes, those chemical reactions that have everything to do with how your body processes the energy that you consume, but it includes every other chemical reaction in there as well. And an important thing to note here is that metabolism is really an emergent property of life. Metabolism arises from this ordered interaction of molecules, right? One molecule being able to interact with another molecule to get a chemical reaction going, and that might set off another chemical reaction and another chemical reaction to accomplish something within that organism, right? So individual molecules by themselves will have some properties, but then you start allowing these molecules to interact, and all of a sudden you've got this huge chemical pathway that can do a lot of work or a lot of good within a cell. So when we talk about metabolism, we're talking about chemical reactions. And the chemical reactions that take place within the cell, some of them are standalone. And there's just one chemical reaction accomplishes this function and that's it. But honest truth, most times within a cell or within an organism, chemical reactions are kind of strung together to create what is called a metabolic pathway, because it takes a lot of energy, a lot of effort to go sometimes from having one kind of molecule all the way to a different kind of molecule. You can't just do it in one step, and so it has to be done in a series of steps to go from point A to point D. So on this slide, we have one very simplified generic example of a metabolic pathway. So in this case, we have A, this is our starting molecule, and we want to take A and we want to convert it all the way down here to our product D. And this is a 3-step process, or there are 3 different chemical reactions that need to take place to help us get from A to D. So as we look at this, right, each chemical reaction is going to be catalyzed by its own enzyme. right? Enzymes show specificity, meaning that each enzyme really can only accomplish one function. One enzyme might be able to build a protein. Another enzyme might be able to build DNA. Another enzyme might be able to degrade carbohydrates. But each of those enzymes can only perform its designated function, and it can't do other things. So in this case, enzyme 1 has the ability to catalyze the first reaction of going from A to B. So if we're looking at this particular chemical reaction, our reactants, or starting molecule here, is A, and enzyme 1 will take A and will convert it to B, which is our product for the first chemical reaction. From here, right, we're one step closer to getting to D, but we're not quite there yet. From here, enzyme 2 will now take B, which was the product of the first reaction, but now it becomes the reactant of the second reaction, and enzyme 2 takes that B and converts it to C. C is now the product of the second reaction. From here, C now becomes the reactant of the third reaction, catalyzed by enzyme 3, and enzyme 3 will take C and convert it into D, our end product of this particular metabolic pathway. Now, this already might seem a little complex, but let me just give you an idea of how complex metabolic pathways can actually be in a living organism. This next image is not in your textbooks, and I don't have to memorize it. I just wanted to show you what maybe a map of various metabolic reactions within a cell would look like. So each pathway is color-coded a different color. Each circle is a molecule, and lines are going to show you chemical reactions that convert one molecule to another. And so what you'll notice is that it's complicated, right? It looks like a big circuit board. There are also molecules like this one right here that's shown in kind of this blue color, but it intersects with the orange pathway, so amino acid metabolism, intersects with this kind of teal pathway, lipid metabolism, intersects with this light purple pathway, which might be part of energy metabolism. I'm not quite sure here. So you'll see that molecules can sort of branch off, and depending what the cell needs, they can go one pathway or to another pathway. So there are a lot of connections between various metabolic pathways within an organism. All right, so now as we start discussing more specifically some of these metabolic pathways, when you take the metabolic pathways found in a cell, they can be kind of categorized into two different groups. The first group is called a catabolic pathway. Catabolic pathways are going to release energy by breaking down complex molecules into simpler compounds. A really good example of a catabolic pathway is what we're going to discuss in Chapter 9, which is cellular respiration. Cells are going to take an ordered molecule of glucose, very complex, stores a lot of energy. Cells are going to break down that glucose down to simple molecules of carbon dioxide and water, and in the process, energy is released that was once stored in that glucose molecule, and that energy can be used to drive cellular work. The other category of metabolic pathways are the anabolic pathways. These do the exact opposite. So they are going to consume energy to build complex molecules from simpler ones. Great example of this is the creation of a protein from amino acids. Right? Every time you attach a new amino acid to make that longer and longer polypeptide, the cell is going to have to use some of the energy. Right? Amino acids are not going to build themselves. Right? You have to input that energy to stick them together. Another really good example of an anabolic pathway is what we're going to discuss in Chapter 10, which is photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, organisms can use energy from sunlight to drive the creation of large complex sugar molecules simply by taking carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil. Now, in both cases, anabolic and catabolic pathways, we're talking about either energy being released, catabolic, or energy being consumed, anabolic. So the transfer of energy in metabolic pathways is very important. So maybe we need to take a couple steps back, reintroduce what energy is, and talk about the different forms of energy first before we talk about how they apply to metabolism and metabolic reactions. So energy is the capacity to cause change. And we know that energy exists in a variety of different forms, and some of these forms can be used to perform work. In this particular course, we stress two main forms of energy, kinetic and potential. We're going to review those on the next slide. And what we also have learned is that energy can be converted from one form to another. So, for example, you can take kinetic energy and turn it into potential, or take potential energy and then convert it into kinetic. So let's review one more time what exactly kinetic and potential energy are and give some examples. So remember that kinetic energy is the energy that's associated with motion, right? Anything that's moving is showing that kinetic energy. One example of kinetic energy that we have already talked about in this course is heat, which is thermal energy, or the transfer of thermal energy, right? Thermal energy is that random vibration or motion that's associated with molecules and atoms. Another example of kinetic energy is also light. You may not think about it this way, but light is a form of kinetic energy. We're going to talk a little bit more about light when we get to the chapter on photosynthesis. The other form of energy that we stress is potential energy. And if you recall from our discussion of electrons, which also have potential energy, we talked about how potential energy is the energy that matter has based on its location or based on its structure. So particularly in this chapter, when we're looking at chemical reactions, we're going to be focusing on potential energy that's stored in the structure of a molecule. And so one example of this kind of potential energy is chemical energy. This is the potential energy that's available for release within a chemical reaction. So if you think about it, when you have a catabolic reaction like cellular respiration, you take a glucose molecule that has a lot of this potential energy. It's chemical energy that can be released in a chemical reaction. So when you break down that glucose molecule, that energy gets released and can be used by the cell to drive cellular work. Now let's take a look at just an everyday, perhaps, example of where potential and kinetic energy show themselves in the real world, and how we can convert between potential kinetic and kinetic to potential. So in this slide, we are looking at a picture of friends enjoying a diving platform on a lake in the summertime. Let's start with this guy up here on top of the diving platform. He's not moving currently, we can imagine, but he has a lot of potential energy just because of his location. He's very high up on this diving platform, very unstable. It's easy for him to fall down. He can take this potential energy and he can convert it to kinetic energy by jumping off of the diving platform. As he's diving into the water, he's moving, right? He's converting that potential energy to kinetic energy until he lands in the water here. From here, this is his lowest energy level, right? He's lost all of that potential energy as it was converted to kinetic energy when he jumped off. But now what he can do is he can use the kinetic energy of his muscles contracting and moving to swim, and then climb, and then walk, and then climb all the way back here until he reaches the top of the diving platform. So he's used the kinetic energy of his muscles contracting, converting that kinetic energy to the potential energy of being way up high again. So multiple examples here of where you can shift between different energy forms.